All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to So You Want to Get Into Japanese Cinema. Or it could be Japanese Cinema 101, or as I'm calling it, Japanese Cinema 101 Fun. I'm trying to make this as fun as possible, and Todd and I definitely really had to pull ourselves back to make sure that this was 101 and we weren't getting into 102, 103, and 104 because, I don't know, depending on what we really wanted to talk about, we could. But don't worry, I told Todd we can't talk about Tetsuo the Iron Man. That's strictly 102. And we can't tell the nice people about that movie because that movie's insane. Maybe next year, Todd, don't worry.
I'd be a little concerned what program we could get away with that on.
I mean, well, didn't we kind of talk about it with body horror
That's
briefly?
fair.
Briefly. So why am I doing this program and why am I into Japanese culture? So I'm not going to say how many years ago because, as I was joking earlier about other things, that math is offensive to me. When I was a teenager in the early aughts, I was a little weeb kid. I was into Dragon Ball Z. Pokemon had come out. We were starting to get stuff like Princess Mononoke. So, in other words, I was interested in anime. But anime was not as easy to get as it is now. There's no Crunchyroll. Toonami wasn't even a thing when I was starting to get into it, or it was very new. And if you know what Toonami is, you had to stay up until 11 o'clock at night on Saturdays on Cartoon Network to watch anime. That was it, unless you wanted to watch Sailor Moon or Dragon Ball Z. But what I did have was my local library. And while they didn't have anime there, they had Japanese films. They had a little burgeoning foreign film collection. So I checked out this film, didn't know it was by this very famous director, but it was called Mabarosi. And I saw it had a good review from Roger Ebert on the box, brought it home and watched it, and was like, wow, this is really good. What the Japanese movies are there? So saw what I could. The selection wasn't great because what was available at the time. But in addition to liking anime, I started to go, oh, I should watch live action Japanese cinema as well. And by the time I got to college, there were a lot more opportunities for me to explore not just Japanese cinema, but Japanese history as well. And as I've kind of moved beyond anime in terms of my interests, I have really stayed with Japanese cinema and especially just the post-war period of Japanese cinema and Japanese literature, but that's a whole other discussion. So this is kind of a passion project for me, Todd. I don't know if you have a story about how you got into Japanese film or that you'd like to share.
So some of this is similar beats, but there are two particular exceptions that come up on my end. The first is I have said for years my particular nerding gateway drug goes to watching old Godzilla movies with my grandpa. Particularly the first that made the impression was Godzilla versus Megalon, which I know I've discussed in the program before, but I got to give it its due. The other being, after I started to find out about anime, there was a time I was talking to my godfather about films. I had mentioned the movie Akira. There had been one of those miscommunication moments where he thought I was talking about the movie Ikiru, which is another excellent movie. Just those are two tonally very different
I was
films.
about to say, oh no, if you watch Akira thinking you're going to get Akiru, you're going to be in for shock.
Anyway, from there got to he was telling me about Kurosawa, and then that year for Christmas, I got it was like from him I got a collection which was or stores was like Seven Samurai, Rashomon, The Hidden Fortress, Sanjuro, and Yojimbo.
Hmm.
Several
Yeah.
of which I am due for a rewatch on, but that's neither here nor there.
Well, we have a lot of the Criterion Blu-rays and 4Ks, so we could do it.
Yeah, well, granted, those are still standard def, but hey.
All right. No, we upgraded Seven Samurai. I think we upgraded
Yeah,
Akira.
but Rashomon, Yojimbo, and Sanjuro are still DVD.
Okay. All right. So as I said up top, this is 101. If you have some base familiarity with Japanese cinema, some of these names might sound familiar to you, but again, this is supposed to be entry level, and not only entry level, it's what's available in the United States. Even with the availability of streaming due to rights issues and just distributors thinking what's going to be seen and what isn't, there is a whole lot of stuff in Japan that we do not get over here. And thankfully, there's piracy. You can still see stuff, but unless you find someone who subtitles it or you know Japanese, you still might not get everything. But we're still last year was a very good year for Japanese film in the United States. We had Perfect Days, which technically directed by Wim Wenders, but I'm like, I think that counts as a Japanese film. We had it premiered at a festival last year. It finally came over this year. Ryusuke Hamaguchi's Evil Does Not Exist came out. If you don't recognize that name, he directed Drive My Car. We had Hayao Miyazaki's first film in 10 years, Boy and the Heron, come out, and we had Hirokazu Koreeda's Monster come out. Uh, we're getting a lot more over here. It's still, and this is the same with a lot of foreign language features from other countries. What we get is merely a sample as opposed to what they get, and in many cases, same goes on their end. So I want to start with a couple of points of history for things that are going to come up in many cases, especially on the latter half. So 1896, this is the first public exhibit of film in Japan. And Japanese production studios, they started pretty quickly afterwards. And if you know a lot about early film, they weren't even narratives. In many cases, it was just filmed moving images. So some of the earliest Japanese films are just people filming. I shouldn't say geishas. I think the proper term is geiko and meiko. Geishas actually have a completely different connotation in Japan. Filming them walking or just filming a street, like a street venue and people walking along. And by 1903, there had been a theater built in Tokyo with movies catering to the wealthy. And that's not entirely outside of the realm of what cinema was when it first started. It was definitely a little bit more for wealthier people in the first few years. The first production studio, 1909. So that's kind of the start of film in Japan. And they had their own, they had silent films, similar to us. They had the whole transition from the silent to the sound. There's actually one director we will discuss who made that transition very well. But now this is where certain things are going to come into a lot of the directors we discuss. In the 1930s, Japan goes to war, and if you're really counting when did World War II start, if we're counting both aggressors, 1931, Japan goes into Manchuria. So war starts in Japan, and at that point, the Japanese government starts to get more and more involved with the film industry. They want propaganda. There are many directors who are famous who either fought in the war, served in the war, and many of them did not have good things to say about it after and are not happy with their participation. Some of them made war propaganda. Going back to one of my earlier programs on Setsuko Hara actually starred in Japanese German co-productions in the 1930s. And so we saw that, and similar thing happened in Germany as well. And to be fair, in America, the United States government got involved in cinema as well to produce their own kind of propaganda, patriotic features, something that happened in World War II. 1945, the United States defeats Japan and the occupation happens. And that does not only influence the government of Japan and kind of changes the society of Japan and the culture in many ways. It influences cinema in terms of what you can show and what you can't show. One of the things that was outlawed for a while was showing like traditional Japanese values. And that's going to come into play with certain thing, a big genre that we talk about, but period features, things that showed like the more Confucian values. The US government was like, ooh, we don't want that because we're trying to modernize this society. 1951, probably the watershed year for Japanese cinema in the international sphere, is Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon comes out. Interestingly enough, not a big hit in Japan. That's actually a story of a lot of movies that made it big, that were like huge watershed moments for Japan cinema in the United States. They weren't big here. Another big example is the anime Akira. Not a big hit in Japan, became the anime you had to see in order to get initiated into like the otaku fan clubs back in the day. Through the 1950s through the 70s, we had Japanese new wave cinema, and that's going to encompass a lot of the people we talk about, because that's really, in terms of what we're seeing now, the formative years of modern Japanese cinema. And just a quick note here, the 5 big Japanese studios, Nikatsu, Shochiku, Toho. If you have loved Godzilla, by the way, you've heard of Toho. Toei and Daiei. So moving on, we're going to talk about the directors you should know. And this was a hard thing for us to narrow down because it's again, who is the entry point? Who can you find over here in terms of a lot of work and whose movies are accessible? And again, if we're thinking in 101, I hope, I think we made the right choice. And I think there's no one else to start with than Akira Kurosawa. He's pretty much, if you ask anybody about Japanese cinema, he's probably the first name that's going to come up that's not Hayao Miyazaki. The man directed The Seven Samurai. The man directed Rashomon. The Hidden Fortress was one of the primary inspirations, not but one of the big inspirations for Star Wars. This man's cinematic footprint has inspired hundreds, if not potentially thousands of films. And you could argue, I know when people talk about like what's the first big blockbuster, if we're talking chronologically, it is Birth of a Nation. It is the first blockbuster movie, contest side. Then people talk about Jaws, the big modern blockbuster. But if we're talking about the structure of a modern, especially a modern action blockbuster, I think that's The Seven Samurai. And Todd, would you agree with that? Or am I reaching?
No, I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, Kurosawa's got a few films where it's like their DNA is everywhere, and Seven Samurai is right at the top.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many films that have taken that structure, elements of that story. I mean, probably the most famous example, The Magnificent Seven, was pretty
Mm-hmm.
much let's do Seven Samurai as a Western.
Yeah, and don't worry, we are going to talk about the sort of symbiotic relationship, or actually the similarities between a samurai film and a Western. So lived from 1910 to 1998, directed 30 features. And Todd, he was someone who directed propaganda features during World War II. I don't think he talked too much about those movies. I think he was Kurosawa was someone who never tried to be very vocally political. As opposed to some other directors we'll talk about. But I think the few things he said was was like, not my proudest moment. I prefer to work on the films I'm passionate about. But he is the guy that put Japanese cinema on the map with Rashomon. And Rashomon's another movie where its DNA is in a lot of movies now. This idea of one story being told by three different people and having three different versions of a story or multiple different versions of a story. I remember, I think even people, the film Gone Girl, people said like there's a little bit of Rashomon in that idea of there's this supposed one story, multiple different versions of it. And granted, the story of Rashomon was not born in that film. That was actually based on a story that had been previously written. But that's another film that just really ignited the global cinema scene. Also introduced the international audiences to Toshiro Mifune, one of the best actors, I think, ever to grace the screen, who has this, or had this, just unbridled nature to him that Kurosawa knew how to harness. Although eventually they stopped working together, Toshiro Mifune ended up becoming a more international star. He would work in Western features. Apparently, Kurosawa was not exactly happy about that. And speaking of people not being happy, Kurosawa is, well renowned in Japan as well for just his contribution to culture, but he was not lauded, universally lauded during his time as a director. He had a number of detractors, most notably Nagisa Oshima, who we will talk about, was definitely who criticized him for being too Western with his films. And some of his movies, considering he focused on the samurai a lot, were considered too elitist by some of the other new wave filmmakers. But regardless of your feelings on him, you can't really deny his impact. And what are his essential works? I mean, you can't even narrow it down to 5. Because even then, it's like, well, yeah, Throne of Blood is great. That's one of the best adaptations of Macbeth. Hidden Fortress is fantastic. Kagemusha is great. But I decided to go with Rashomon, Ikiru. If you saw the film, it was 2022 Living. That was based on the film Akiru. Seven Samurai, I mean, if you have to see any film of his, that's probably the best place to start. Ron, which another Shakespeare adaptation, of this time of King Lear. And I love Dreams. It's his second to last film, but it is a beautiful film. I think one of the most like visually stunning movies I've ever seen. I love the use of color in it. But so we're talking about a guy who did all these epic films, and now we're going to move on to not quite a counterpart, but probably of the post-war period classic Japanese cinema, the other really big name is Yasujiro Ozu, who kind of had a little mini resurgence last year because of the film Perfect Days, and Wim Wenders talked about how much Ozu's work influenced that film. So Ozu, Kurosawa made 30 films. Ozu made over 50 and did not live nearly as long as Kurosawa. Although both of these, I'm just going to say, both of these directors, they could be their own programs. I mean, Kurosawa had a whole career lull period that got pretty bad. That could be its own 10-minute discussion. But Ozu was someone who started making films very young. Got to start making silent films, actually remade some of his silent films when he was older. But he's most famous for his collaborations with actress Setsuko Hara. She was in Late Spring. She's in Tokyo Story. I did a program on her last year. Wonderful actress. And when he passed away in 1963, she retired from acting. And her reasoning was she was tired of it. She never really liked it. There's always been some speculation that she was involved with Ozu in some way. There's never been any proof of that. There's also been speculation that Ozu was gay. He never married. But again, I have yet to see any real solid proof. However, it's one where it's like possible, but no proof for that. But his films are, Kurosawa has the epics, and granted, I should say Kurosawa does have his quiet films like Akiru. But Ozu is one that was very about capturing Japanese life as he saw it, although he had some of his own, there was criticism of him because he only captured a very specific part of Japanese life, and Shohei Imamura, who actually worked with him for a bit, kind of was like, oh, Ozu's vision is a little too clean for me. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But a lot of Ozu's works are over here thanks to the Criterion Collection. Same with Kurosawa. And we have a number of both of these directors' films in our foreign language collection. So now getting on to some more modern directors. Hirokazu Koreeda. I love this man's work. He made a film in 2018 called Shoplifters, which in terms of foreign language features that year, that kind of got bulldozed by Alfonso Cuarón's Roma. But if you ask me, Shoplifters is the better movie. Shoplifters broke my heart in a way that few movies do. And his films are very good at that. He, kind of like Ozu, or just like a lot of filmmakers, is someone who's just very interested in people. And in a lot of cases, very interested in families that are somewhat non-traditional. And luckily, a lot of his work is available over here. There was a great interview I read with him where he just says, a lot of people compare me to Ozu, but I think I'm more like Mikio Naruse, who was another more early, not quite post-war. He started working in the 1930s. Naruse, and Ken Loach, who is a very well-known British filmmaker who makes a lot of films about the working class. And Koreeda actually has made some films outside of Japan. He made a French film called The Truth, and he made Broker, which is from South Korea, about 2 years ago. We actually have his newest film, Monster, in our collection right now. And Mabarosi, again, as a teenager, I did not know that this guy was a fairly big name in Japanese cinema. I was just like, oh, this is a movie about Japan. I'll watch it. I really enjoyed it. Nobody Knows is a great film. It's actually I think that might be based on a real case, but it is about young children who are abandoned by their mother who have to kind of band together to survive, and another just film that will break your heart in two. So don't watch these movies unless you have a puppy video or something lined up afterwards. So Todd, I'm going to let you take this slide on Kiyoshi Kurosawa, although I will let everybody know, no relation.
That's actually one of the first things that comes up when you search on him, just as a. So as we discussed with this, he's been working as like he's been working pretty steadily. He was one of those kind of came from the ground up, as you saw. He was working with 8mm back when he was in college, back when he was working at school. He actually still teaches as a professor at Tokyo. Let me double check the school here. Yeah, it's Tokyo Art University. So he's also kind of helping bring up the next generation.
Yeah,
He's one of
which
those.
Oscar winner Ryusuke Hamaguchi just won a couple of years ago for Drive My Car. So
And this is another where we've only, for a while there, we did not have as much from him. He is one we are slowly getting more of his work on. And it's a little awkward because hearing him in interviews, he is a director who has tried to avoid necessarily being put into a particular box per se. Like he wants to try and keep versatile, but he is probably most famously known for his work, his contributions to Japanese horror, which is actually what two of these titles in the Essential Works are about. Cure is it is a psychological horror movie that he did that is generally regarded as it's basically seen as like this was one of the ones that really helped usher in the like DJ horror boom of the late 90s, early 2000s. I will say it's worth seeing, although if you are squeamish, there are a couple of parts there you might want to go in prepared for. There was even one where I had a moment of, wait a minute, where does this go? Oh boy. The other is like his other really well-known horror example is the second title on that list, Pulse, which is it is a more supernatural horror. It is like one part supernatural, one part technology, which without giving too much away, I will say it is still one of the bleakest horror movies I have ever seen. It was remade here in the 2000s to really mixed reception because it did away with a lot of the very there is a very pointed social commentary in the original Japanese version of Pulse that is conspicuously absent in the remake.
mhm.
The remake is
I
just
was
looking
about
more.
to say mixed reception is being charitable.
They somehow managed to squeeze out two sequels.
Yeah. Also, we do have one of his films in our collection, The Wife of a Spy, which is a historical political thriller.
Yeah,
So the man has some range. Also, I think we should just point out you're going to see the term pink film brought up a lot. We can't really discuss pink films because we're a library, and I don't think it belongs in 101. But if you're wondering what they are, I think the nicest way to say is erotica. And hey, everyone has to start somewhere. People need
I
paychecks.
I think if you have to make any sort of like a Western comparison, I'd say like something like the early works of Jonathan Demme, where some of his work for Corman was he did women in prison films as a one for
Yeah.
the studios, one for me deal.
But they're yeah, they're not family friendly or
Oh my no.
I know. But his work is great, and we do have a couple of his works in our collection. And now we're getting to the other name everybody else might recognize, Hayao Miyazaki. Probably if you ask anybody about Japanese animation, he's the name that's going to come up. And once again, like Kurosawa, for good reason. The man's a legend. I would argue he is the greatest living animator, and he is one of our greatest living directors. As Guillermo del Toro said, animation is not for children, it's a medium. It's still cinema. And Miyazaki's works are always cinematic and a great example of utilizing the medium of animation to create art rather than just a distraction for 5-year-olds for 90 minutes. I still remember seeing Princess Mononoke as a teen and being blown away with what I was seeing and going, oh, wait, animation can be like this, telling you a real story. And in the United States, Roger Ebert was one of Miyazaki's earliest big boosters. And he's great. I do refer to him as like a grumpy cinema uncle because every time you see him in interviews, he just seems tired and grumpy. But he's extremely passionate about his work. He's to a perfectionist. To the point where he might not be the nicest boss to work with, but the man is standards. There is a sadder version to this where he's kind of admitted that his devotion to his work strained his relationship with Son Goro, who was also an animator. But he is, if you have never seen any of his work, I would highly recommend doing so. You can't go wrong with any of his films. There's no such thing as a bad Miyazaki movie. but probably the best place to start is Spirited Away. That's probably the title everyone's most familiar with.
The one
Um,
that got him his first Oscar.
it got him, yeah, and he won another one last year just for coming back after 10 years. Everyone was just like, here you go, dude. We thought we'd never get another movie out of you. I also love him because he, despite working in anime, and we'll discuss this a little later, anime in Japan is not just for kids. It's an entire animation is an entire medium as opposed to the United States, where, at least on the cinema level, animation really has not gotten past stuff for children in many cases. Every now and then we get something for adults, but not too much. But he has been very vocal in his criticism of the current state of anime for being too cookie cutter, and in many cases saying there's too much fan service now. The inmates run the asylum. There are these young men who've never really gotten outside. They're just obsessed with their shows, and now they're making stuff and it's devoid of any real human feeling, which, I mean, hey, I kind of said I've fallen out of anime, and that's a big reason why. But we will come back to Hayao Miyazaki later. Other directors of note, again, it's really hard to just narrow this down, but again, I was thinking 101 and trying to give a good mix of things. So Kenji Mizoguchi, he is up there with Ozu and Kurosawa in terms of being an incredibly influential director from that time period in Japan. Sancho the Bailiff and Ugetsu are amazing, just works of art, and he's another guy who could probably have his own program. Kon Ichikawa, who actually collaborated with his wife until she passed away from breast cancer when he was a filmmaker. She would help with a lot of his script doctoring. Burmese Harp and Actor's Obsession. These are movies you can find here. Shohei Imamura, a director I am a huge fan of. He is someone who loves, or he loved to look at the kind of underbelly of Japanese society, although he always said, like, I never thought I looked at like the lower classes or the dregs of society. I thought I just looked at people in Japan. But he would do works that would dealt with the station of women in society. There's a film called Pigs and Battleships, which deals with the United States occupation. And he remade the film Battle of Narayama. Um, not just to remake the story, but he remade it as a searing critique of not of Japanese tradition, but just this idea of tradition for tradition's sake. And it's a very visceral film too. If you can seek it out, it's well worth watching. Nagisa Oshima, take a moment if you have a smartphone and Google this man and look at his face. That is the face of a man who has opinions. Um, and he very vocal with his dislike of Kurosawa. But his films are they're very visceral, very political, and he likes to be very in your face. He likes to challenge you. So it's not for everyone, but he is one of the key figures of Japanese New Wave. Also, if you're a David Bowie fan, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. He is in that as a main character. Well, not David Bowie, but he plays the main character. Seijun Suzuki. If you're into crime films, if you love something like Tarantino, Branded to Kill and Tokyo Drifter, huge influences on that style. Hiroshi Teshigahara, Woman in the Dunes. Really, that's a film that I would just put as unsettling and haunting. And it's not a traditional horror movie, but there's something about it that just feels so otherworldly about it. And same with The Face of Another. Now two more modern directors, Takashi Miike. This is a guy who he's made over, what's it, Todd? He over 100 at least. Extremely prolific
Yeah,
filmmaker.
he crossed the 100 line with his live action adaptation of Blade of the Immortal, which was in, I want to say, 2018. Let me double check
Yeah,
that.
he's probably up to what, 120 now?
Oh, I'll let you know in just a sec.
But he can do everything from completely normal films like First Love, like there's this film he did called First Love, or no, Pure Love, sorry. And then there's stuff like Audition. Happiness of the Katakuris is like a horror musical. Then there's stuff like Ichi the Killer, which that's not for everyone, but I feel if we're doing 101, we have to talk about Takashi Miike just because of how ever present he is in the current industry. And to round that out, Ryusuke Hamaguchi, Drive My Car is probably the film everyone's most familiar with, but He did another film I still need to sit down and watch because it is 5 hours long, called Happy Hour. And that is lauded in both international circles and in Japan as one of the greatest Japanese films of the new millennium. And he recently, one of his newer films, Evil Does Not Exist, did get a release over here. I think it's going to get a disc release soon, but if you can check out any of his work, I would highly recommend it. Drive My Car is one of those movies where it is 3 hours long. You never feel it because you're just so invested in everyone on the screen. So now we're going to look at some genres. And where else to start but with samurai films, or as they're known, Shanbara.
By the way, just to
What?
update, I didn't get a clear count on the number, but Blade of the Immortal came out in 2017, and he has been making more since then. So
Yeah, it's like he's probably up to 115 now. The guy, I don't know when the guy sleeps, but samurai films, um, there's a reason that the United States and United States filmmakers saw a lot of the samurai films and said, oh, hey, we can do that as Westerns. Because you can find a lot of parallels between a samurai and like the cowboy figure. They're very ingrained in each country's culture. Like, the samurai is very unique to Japan. The idea of a cowboy, very unique to the United States. They have this idea of kind of, the fierce warrior. The cowboy is the frontier image versus the samurai is the honorable, so-called honorable warrior. And these films can range anywhere from being very lauding and what a good word be, Todd? I'm blanking on this right now. Well, celebratory. I have it right there. And then you have films that are highly critical of it and kind of try to peel back the mythology. And if you watch The Seven Samurai, there are moments of that as well where it is like, yeah, the samurai are not always the heroes of this. So even in a film that almost became synonymous with the samurai genre, it's a film that's not entirely celebratory. And you have a lot of like the spaghetti westerns took influence from the samurai films as well. So I said we'd come back to the U.S. occupation period of Japan. So the Jidaigeki, they're period dramas. They were big in the 20s and 30s and coming into the 40s. And then the United States occupation happens. For a while, they were not allowed because there was a ban on the feudal values and anything that was seen as traditional. So United States censors didn't like that at first. And granted, as with a lot of censorship, sometimes this stuff starts to loosen its grip a little bit, but there was a period of time where the samurai films just weren't made because it was discouraged. So the notable samurai movies, again, you got to go with The Seven Samurai. There's Lone Wolf and Cub, Zatoichi. Fun fact, if you like Zatoichi, that's the Blind Swordsman series. There is a film starring Rutger Hauer called Blind Fury, and that is inspired by Zatoichi. Kind of a similar vein of both very fun, but also a little cheesy. Some more modern examples, you have 13 Assassins. There's the Miyamoto Musashi series, where he was a real person, but he's was an inspiration for a number of samurai films in Japan. And Todd, I'll let you talk a little bit about Harakiri briefly.
So, per your point about the not all these are necessarily celebratory, Harakiri is that is an incredibly critical film of like a lot of the Bushido warrior mentality because it is basically a story of it is a revenge story trying to avenge one man who was basically forced into the ritual suicide to a ritual suicide honor killing.
So yeah, and that is, I think that's also a Criterion title, and
Yeah,
that's
that one's
yeah,
Masaki Kobayashi, I believe.
yes. So moving on to another kind of crime pictures you can find anywhere in the world, but there is one crime picture that's very specific to Japan, and that's the Yakuza picture. So if you like the mob movies in America, try the Yakuza pictures. But again, crime films, that umbrella is very big in Japan. So you do have the Yakuza features. I would say Beat Takashi's crime movies, like Violent Cop, are really, they can be rough watches, but they're also really good. They have the sense of coolness to them. Again, these are movies that had a lot of influence on people like Tarantino. If you're seeing Lady Snowblood, Battle Without Honor and Humanity, you're like, hey, why am I thinking of Kill Bill? That's why. Um, the part of the I guess the movies that fall under the crime umbrella that I find really interesting are the delinquent teen delinquent stories. Stuff like Crazed Fruit, Cruel Story of Youth, which are Cruel Story of Youth, a Nagisa Oshima film, which are looking at the kind of aimlessness and anxiety of the teens at the time in the late 50s, early 60s. These kids who were born during the war are coming of age during the occupation, and at a time where there was a lot of uncertainty. Their country had changed very dramatically in a short amount of time. And have this sense almost of nihilism. And again, they're not the happiest watches in the world, but they're really fascinating to watch within the context of their time.
Especially
Um,
also from our perspective, it's like on paper, some of these could easily sound like moral panic movies, and
mhm.
these are not them.
Yeah, Cruel Story of Youth is not a moral panic film at all. If any, it's not framed as a, oh, this nice innocent girl went bad and now look what happened to her. It's more life in the world as it is just repeatedly flinging just horrible things at this girl, and she is just trying to find a way out of them. It's if anything, it is the idea of the world is cruel to her. And I say here there is a true crime vein. So there's a film called Vengeance is Mine, which is about a real serial killer in Japan. Death by Hanging is about an execution. It's a film that explores the idea of the death penalty. The way the death penalty is done in Japan, as of right, has been for a while, still is. If you get a death sentence, you do not know when that will happen. You find out, isn't it pretty much the day of? Because
I'm not
I
sure really
believe
how
that is
much
what
heads up there
happened.
is on that.
I think that is what happened to a number of the people involved with Shinrikyo. There is not a lot of transparency with it. Um, Although death by hanging is more about the whole moral idea of the death penalty itself. That's an Oshima film as well. But that was based on something real. And there's a 2004 film called Concrete. I don't think it's available over here. That is based on a real life killing of a teen girl by teen boys. You might not want to go read up on that story because it's incredibly depressing. And again, you have the Jidaigeki films that kind of are crime revenge tales like Lady Snowblood, which again, if you are a Kill Bill fan, you should see Lady Snowblood. And we're kind of veering into that. We're going into the socio-political films now. So if you want films with a real socio-political bent, I would say look at the films by Oshima and Imamura. The films that are available here and accessible, they're the two directors I would go to. But prior to them, because they're both new wave directors, 20s and 30s did have these tendency films, which were not quite moral panic movies, but they were films that explored moral issues of the time, which is similar to, if you look at 20s and 30s films in the United States, we did similar. So even 20s and 30s films would deal with women who worked in prostitution, people dealing with poverty. They were a little more moralistic as to how they dealt with it. It didn't have the moral ambiguity of the new wave films, but in many cases, they're still fairly sympathetic to their protagonists. And as I mentioned earlier, Japanese government had a lot of pressure to create propaganda during World War II. But post-war Japan, you had, again, from people like Kon Ichikawa, Oshima, Imamura, you had an explosion of anti-war films from people who saw the war firsthand, experienced it, the effects of it, or in some cases were, conscripted into war and not exactly proud of what they did or what they saw. That all came out. So you have films like Fires on the Plain and oh geez, I misspelled plane. I knew I misspelled something. The Burmese Harp. Kurosawa, the closest you could say he got to a political film is No Regrets for Our Youth, which is about a woman kind of figuring herself out politically and becoming involved in less leftist political movements. And I also wanted to point this out because there is now, I don't want to say conventional wisdom, but there is an idea that a lot of people in the United States have that Japan never confronted its past in the war and its crimes. And that is very false. Again, there were a number of directors who came with the new wave, who were very wanted to tackle this head on. And it wasn't as explicit as I think some people might expect, but I don't know how you can watch a movie like The Burmese Harp and think that this isn't confronting Japan's past as well. And Japan's war crimes were confronted in media. If anything, there started to be a backlash to it in the early 80s because there were these groups of more nationalistic people in Japan who were like, well, we don't want the next generation to feel bad about what Japan did or feel ashamed of their country. But this idea that Japanese media and Japanese artists never confronted what happened in World War II is just a falsehood. And that's why I say, like, this is something people should explore. And again, I keep bringing up Oshima and Imamura. Would get extremely political in their films. Again, Pigs and Battleships is about the American occupation, and the main female character in that film is someone who is very explicitly abused by the GIs that live there. And if you know anything about a lot of the controversy about certain bases, Okinawa is a big one. There are still controversies and issues that stem from that. And they would also deal with stuff, just domestic issues. Again, the station of women in their country, women's autonomy, the death penalty, and even blanking on something. Sorry. You would like there if So I wanted to go back to the Insect Woman. That is that is a film that tracks a woman from through her life and the various things she has to do to survive, and rather having it be voyeuristic, it is a film that shows that the society that she lives in, even though it's so-called very modern, it's still not one that can really take care of someone like her. She still has to resort to a lot of things in order to get by. And there's still modern political films. While it's known here for a bit more urban legendy reasons, Battle Royale is a very political film. And there's films like United Red Army. There's a recent film that came out that we do have in our collection called Plan 75. That is a film in which the government's, because there's low birth rates and there are more elderly Japanese than there are younger Japanese to take care of them, that starts to offer a dying program for people who are over the age of 75. It's just, you could just commit suicide and that's fine. It's a film we have here. I would highly recommend checking it out. So on to something a little bit lighter, the domestic story. So that's kind of more the Yasujiro Ozu stuff. But I would say even they would not always be all sunshine and rainbows. I mean, Todd, you said Tokyo Story always makes you cry.
I mean, that is famously seen as like one of the big tearjerkers of Japanese cinema,
Yeah.
up there with Ikiru and Grave of the Fireflies.
Yeah. But you have one of his films, Tokyo Twilight, is about, it discusses divorce. It has one of the characters is having an affair with a man, and she decides to end her pregnancy. It's not something you would think from Ozu, where I think a lot of the people who, without having seen his work, just think he makes very, nice, inoffensive domestic films. The most interesting thing, this came from the more post-war and kind of came in a little bit with the new wave, was who these movies were directed towards. So there were films about wealthy families, and you would actually see kind of in the 1930s and 40s films about wealthy families, in some cases wealthy families adjusting to lost wealth. But that didn't really speak to a majority of Japanese people. So as the post-war period rolled on, more and more of these domestic dramas were about the middle class, and in some cases the lower class. And that appealed to more people, and those were the ones that tended to have more staying power. And the domestic stories don't always have to be, come on, Bart, cartoons don't have to always be realistic, but they don't always have to be 100% serious. So there are films like The Taste of Tea and Kamikaze Girls, which take fairly standard stories, but there is a level of surrealism to them that kind of heightens them a bit, but they're still wonderful little watches. So for note, actually one of the notable films, Sweet Bean, that's a film that takes on medical, I guess it would be medical discrimination or stigma, because one of the characters is recovered from leprosy and has to keep that a secret due to social stigma. And one of the recent films I've talked about a lot is Perfect Days. That is about a man who cleans the Tokyo toilets and just the life he chooses to lead, which is a fairly simple one. And you actually see about third of the way through the film, or 2/3 of the way through the film, that he comes from a wealthier family and actively rejected this idea of a more comfortable life to live what he considers just a life of what he needs. Also, something you should note in domestic stories in Japan: death is a big thing that is explored a lot. The funeral, departures, there's also afterlife. That stuff keeps coming up. Wild Berries, I think, is about that as well. It is in usually not in the tear jerky way. In America, if there's a film about death, in many cases, it's usually a little bit more. It's not that it's not heartfelt here, but it's a drama. Versus in Japan, it's kind of a, well, this is just a thing that happens in our life. It can be a source of comedy, it can be a source of tears, or it's just a, well, this is just what we're dealing with right now. So, oh, finally, I get to talk about House. No one does weird like Japan. I don't want to stereotype, but there are some movies that came out of Japan where I'm like, there's no other movie like this. And one of the ones I love is Nobuhiko Obayashi's House. That is a film. It is a haunted house movie. But it's not scary. It's just funny. And one of the highlights of my life was going to see a screening of this at the Harvard Film Archive back in 2015?
That sounds about right,
Yeah,
yeah.
2015. And Obayashi was there in person, and he talked about making it and how his 11-year-old daughter helped him write some of the deaths in the movie. And he was just like, oh, she thought it'd be scary if a piano ate a person. It's like, all right, I'll do that.
It's kind of one of the best scenes in that movie.
It is. But yeah, they're sort of like how surrealism and fantasy can creep its way into domestic stories in movies like Kamikaze Girls and Taste of Tea. You then see it completely unleashed in their more cult films. So actually Tanpopo was directed by the same man who directed The Funeral, has a lot of magical realism in it. It's also just a really fun watch. Wild Zero is a zombie musical movie. It was the zombie musical before Anne and the Apocalypse came out. Then there's some films like All About Lily Choo Choo, which I actually heard the soundtrack before I saw the movie, which is a more experimental film. There's stuff like Jellyfish Eyes, and most recently, there's this film called One Cut of the Dead, which is a zombie film told from 3 different angles. And I think I'll just leave it there because that was a fun film to just watch unfold. But what do the Japanese cult films tend to fall into? Kind of fall into horror. They do fall into crime, like some of the stuff I talked about, like the Stray Cat Rock, Alley Cat Rock, that definitely falls into cult as well. You have your fantasy, or again, the Pink films. There's a cult following for that, but again, we're a library. We can't really talk about that here without potentially getting in trouble. There's also a great little production house called the Directors Company. And again, if you're into the cult horror films, you know who they are. They had movies called Evil Dead Trap and Mermaid Legend, which are not for everybody, but they're like the sort of like Evil Dead over there, where they're kind of really, it was filmmakers who wanted to make their own stuff without any studio interference, very indie. So again, maybe that's why they called it Evil Dead Trap, but it was this idea of people just making their own stuff, very low budget, but very authentic. And that's one of the stuff I love about a lot of the Japanese cult features is I'm like, man, I can't think of anything in the United States that has an equivalent, at least, especially not to House. And By the way, we own house here. I bought a copy for the library. I knew we needed to have this in the collection. So finally, we're getting to J-horror, which, I mean, Todd, this could be its own program as well.
Yeah, that's one you may want to stick a pin in for the future. I mean, incidentally, some of this also may be coming up in October, so if you want to get some pre-gaming in, a couple of titles on that
Yeah.
list to keep in mind.
So we are talking, Todd is talking about folk horror this October, and some of that, there are films in Japan that fall into that because the bones of a lot of Japanese horror stories come from old Japanese folk tales. So films like Kawaii, Onibaba, Kuroneko, all inspired by old Japanese folk legends. Kabuki is something, Kabuki, which is one of their theatrical styles, has a lot of its fingerprints in Japanese horror. Even if you've seen the original version of The Ring, there are a lot of scholars that have said the exaggerated face that Sadako gives at the end, or more what she does with her eye, is a callback to Kabuki, the very exaggerated facial features. So early horror shorts, like as Jizo the Ghost, Resurrection of a Corpse. But a lot of the stuff that you can find here, Jigoku. Jigoku is a journey through hell, but from a Buddhist perspective, but it's still really gnarly.
Yeah, like for half the film, it just reads like it's gonna be a straight kind of morality slash crime story.
Mhm.
Then it takes a sharp turn in the back half.
Yeah, and there is a great little clip set from Criterion called "When Horror Came to Shojiku," and one of them is Gokei Body Snatcher from Hell. It's really fun to see. I know it in Attack of the Mushroom People was streaming for a while. I don't know if it's still streaming. Yeah, it was on Amazon Prime for a bit, but I think that got lost. But that one's a lot of fun. That was also Todd. That was Ishiro Honda, correct?
I believe so. Let me double
Yeah.
check to be certain.
And then, as we mentioned, Pulse, which is directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa. I would say,
Yep, it was Honda.
yes, I was right. Okay. If I had to pick one film as okay, what's a good J-horror title? If we're going to go old school, I would say start with Onibaba. If we're going new school, more modern, I would say start with Reek. There's a lot of J-horror, though, especially in some of the more recent years, that's really veered towards gore. So, and again, this is where I'm like, back to 101. If gore is not your thing, you may want to avoid some of those titles. Like if you see Tokyo Gore Police, you might not want to watch it. Also, as I note here, and we can discuss a little later, the 2000s had a J-horror remake craze in the United States. Gore Verbinski remade The Ring, it's a pretty decent remake.
Yeah.
I still think the original is a lot better. I actually think the remake of The Grudge is a little better than the remake of The Ring, but then we started to have One Missed Call, we had Dark Water, we had Pulse, which are all really not great, and the trend kind of fizzled out. But definitely a lot of J-horror here. I have made sure via donations to the collection that our foreign language section has it. So Todd, I'm going to let you talk about this slide. Again, you do have to keep it brief. You did have an entire 80-minute presentation on Godzilla a few years ago.
This is true. So I will keep this brief to the points. As we mentioned here, Godzilla holds the distinction of being the longest running franchise worldwide. I mean, in terms of sheer count, you could probably argue like the Guinness records for things like Dracula and Sherlock Holmes because those are often kind of self-contained. They can't really count for this game. And going off the third note here, this was actually the origin of Godzilla was kind of a weird two-hander. One parts are they kind of want to do something along the lines of the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, the Ray Harryhausen stop motion. We got a dinosaur that is reawakened and rampages through America. And then the writer they had wanted to make a very explicitly anti-nuclear movie out of it. And interesting fun fact, at the time they made this movie, films about the atomic war in Japan weren't really a thing. This kind of broke ground for that.
Yeah, there were more atomic fear films in the United States than there were in Japan at the time.
And part of that was because there was concern of like how do you address this without then also being very critical of America, which at that time with the occupation was a really sore subject. And again, one of the earliest forms of Godzilla was going to be more. There was a lot more pointed commentary, including much more direct parallels to like the Bikini Atoll tests. There's still some of that in the finished film, but that's a topic for a whole other day. Over the years, the Godzilla figure has gone from being an embodiment of nuclear terror to kind of this almost a superhero figure, and back again numerous times. Most recently, Z -1 coming out last year. We're back to the he is it's like he is the embodiment of that nuclear horror again.
Todd, I believe when you went to go see Godzilla -1 and I asked you how it was when you came back, you had a small tear coming out of your eye when you said it was good.
Well, it was between that. I think the line I put it was, if you were to tell me at the start of the year that one of my favorite movies of 2020 it's like of 2023 would be a kaiju movie about survival guilt, my first thought would be, wait, what? Followed by, no, that sounds about right.
Yeah, no. But yeah, I mean, you can't talk about Japanese cinema without talking about Godzilla, which is probably other than anime, its biggest export to the world. And I did actually just find out that Godzilla -1 is getting a regular DVD release. So keep an eye out. It will likely be in our collection. So controversial films, can only pick two, but so there's one called In the Realm of the Senses. This is directed by Nagisa Oshima. It's based on the story of Sada Abe. I don't know if I can really get into the story of Sada Abe, so I would just let you nice people go look that up. She is a real person, and that was a real story. So this had censorship issues in Japan due to it. I've seen this film. I own this film. Very graphic depiction of sex and some unconventional desires. And Japan is weird because it has those, it has the pink films, it has a pornography industry, but there are certain things that they just don't show, and to show it is taboo. And so Oshima kind of knew. He's like, look, if I make this with a Japanese production company, this isn't going to fly. Huh? What if I made it with a French production company? That'll allow me to skirt around that. So got around that, even though there was still some controversy in Japan. Although I found an interview with Oshima, and he's like, not really. There weren't too many regular Japanese people scandalized by it. And he said something along the lines of half the people who saw it were women. And he kind of says like he blames the American occupation along with other things as an influx of Confucianism has made Japan too prudish. Again, Oshima's a man with a lot of opinions. I kind of wish he was still alive because I'd love to hear his thoughts on certain things. So there was a book with stills that was published, and the Japanese government brought obscenity charges against him and the publisher. Although, as Oshima tells it, he actually countersued to keep the book in publication. So I've seen conflicting reports on this. I think it's probably a case of both. They brought charges, and he just said, well, I'm going to sue you back. Eventually, he was found not guilty. That book was allowed to be sold. It was extremely controversial when it came out in the 70s. Even in the US, it was banned from the festival circuit because of how frank its depiction of sex was. It is still a very good film, but again, one I would just say it is a not for everyone movie. And Battle Royale, if anyone's my age, Battle Royale was known as a film that was banned in the United States for years. And that's not entirely true. I mean, I tried to find it because I was like, oh, they don't want you to see this movie. Not exactly the case. It's based on a novel which did get a translation in about 2003, 2004 in the United States. There's also a manga. I can't recommend the manga personally. But there is a totalitarian government that would force classes of kids to fight to the death. When the film came out, there were obvious parallels made to stuff like reality television, or as more people made the connection in Japan, the hyper-competitive academic environment and this idea of kids have to be hyper achievers. In some cases, the families compare them, and just this dog-eat-dog world that they're growing up in. In Japan, this is not a film that was controversial. There were some more conservative government officials who didn't like the content. There were some people who thought the rating was too lax, but in the country, not that much. Helped that it was directed by a pretty well-known veteran director. But in the United States, this is where it had controversy. So you can see this film was made in the year 2000, and there was starting to be more demand for Japanese content in the early aughts. So this is a movie about teenagers being forced to kill each other. What happened in the year 1999, Todd, that would make a couple of distributors in the United States get really cold feet over this topic?
Yeah, so I will also point out, alongside just the post-Columbine era being very uneasy about that, one of the aspects of the Battle Royale contest is everyone is given weapons at random, which means there are a couple of kids in that movie who are getting firearms.
Yeah. Well, and in Japan, that's a whole other layer. So in Japan, guns are not normal there. People do not own firearms. So the idea of kids getting guns there is seen as extra terrifying because it's like, oh God, how do they even have guns at all? But yeah, so there were a lot of distributors in the United States who were not exactly keen on distributing this, and then there were other who said, "Well, we'll take it, but we'd like to censor or remove certain parts of it." Um, the the producers in Japan were like, "No, we're not doing that." And considering this was the early aughts and the internet was not what it was, it started to grow the reputation of being banned when in real life it was just a case of people having cold feet and not exactly wanting to distribute a movie which they felt would court a lot of controversy stateside. But now both of these films are freely available in the United States, and you can watch them and make that decision for yourself. I also just want to do a quick thing here. The books, The Hunger Games, are often accused of ripping off Battle Royale. I do not think that's true. As someone who has read both books, seen the movies, if anything, both of these titles, I mean, there's number one, The Most Dangerous Game, the original Hunting People for Sport movie slash property. But if there's one title both of these movies owe a lot to, it is the film The Running Man. That's the movie where I'm like, no, the DNA for that is in both of these properties. So I would just like to defend the Hunger Games a little bit and say,
It's
no,
actually
didn't rip off Battle Royale. Leave it alone.
they kind of double dipped on Richard Bachman because beside the Running Man, there are also definitely elements of the Long Walk, most
Mhm.
notably the idea of it's a dystopian future where teenagers are forced to basically participate in a death game.
Yes, that as well. And also it just the timeline doesn't work up. Battle Royale was not really readily of like was not well known in culture outside of very niche film circles in the early aughts. So I'm like, yeah, I don't think it lines up. There's enough other media out there that kind of has the seeds of this idea in there.
Like, if you watched this
Oh,
movie at that time, it was because someone you knew had a bootleg.
yeah, that's how I saw it.
Same.
So now the question I knew we'd get to, oh no, I don't have to watch anime, do I? I kind of ragged on anime a bit here, and it is again, I will be very honest. A lot of the stuff being made now, I don't like. And again, I agree with Miyazaki's point. I think it's all too samey. All the plots are very similar. At least the stuff that comes over here, and a lot of that has to do with demand. Like let's Demon Slayer and My Hero Academia are big. Of course, people are going to try to make their own Demon Slayer and My Hero Academia in Japan, and then it's going to get brought over here because that's what the demand is. And so you do always have to remember, again, what we're getting is a sample, and what we get over here is due to demand versus an accurate representation of what's over there. So again, I would say never entirely sell anime short. It's a part of the Japanese cinema like mosaic. You should watch some of it. What I would say though is stick to the movies, the TV series. Some of them go for 500 episodes or more. One Piece is still going. Just don't bother with One Piece. Not that One Piece isn't fun, it's just that's going to eat up a lot of your time. Stick to the movies. They're 2 hours tops. You can do that easily. And Studio Ghibli is a very good start. And just to say, Miyazaki is not all Studio Ghibli. There are other directors that work in that studio, like Takahata, Grave of the Fireflies. Um, Also keep in mind, if you have children or young people, not all anime is for kids. So don't look at Akira and go, oh, I think my 8-year-old will watch that. Your 8-year-old shouldn't watch that. I come from a generation where a lot of us watched that movie way too young because our parents figured it's animated, it should be fine. No, it's not. Same with Ghost in the Shell. However, I would recommend watching these two films because of the impact they have had on American cinema. If you love stuff like The Matrix, you should probably watch these movies because that inspired them. The Canada bike slide that we see here, you see that in media all the time. If you saw Jordan Peele's Nope, he did the bike slide for that. Kiki
You
Palmer
can
does
find
the end of that
you can
movie.
find entire supercuts of references to the
Yeah.
slide.
So again, it's one for if you're very interested in American cinema, especially if you like the kind of cyberpunk genre, I would watch those two films. But I would say Ghibli is a good entry point, and then kind of go from there. And here's a couple of other movies I would recommend. Millennium Actress in Tokyo, Godfathers by Satoshi Kon, an incredibly talented animator who left us way too soon in 2010 after Battle of Pancreatic Cancer. He only made 4 movies and 1 television series. I would recommend Perfect Blue, but that's a heavy watch. But if you do like Black Swan, you might be able to watch that movie. Barefoot Gen, a film that based on a real Hiroshima survivor's account. That's a very graphic film, just letting you know, but it is a movie you should watch. Grave of the Fireflies. If anyone is in Jess's film group, they are going to be discussing that this coming Wednesday. One of the saddest movies ever made, honestly. That's a movie you only watch once, in my opinion. If you want something a little more lighter, Masaki Yuasa, his work is a lot of fun. He gets into the more fantasy, surreal stuff, but he still manages to have heart. Like Ride Your Wave is a film that deals with grief. But then there's stuff like Night is Short, Walk on Girl, which is a lot more fantasy based. But his animation style is it's really like signature to him. There's not a lot of like if you see his work, you're like, that's one of his stuff. Miss Hokusai by Kenshi Hara is really good. Liz and the Bluebird by Naoko Yamada is great. And Mirai came out a couple years ago by Mamoru Hosada. These are all films. Again, they're good entry level movies. There's nothing too crazy. I think a lot of people, they may think of anime kind of like the Dragon Ball Z, where it's a lot of really buff guys screaming for half an hour. And yes, that is Dragon Ball Z. That's why I love that show. But that is not representative of all of anime. So I would say if you want to do anime, test it out, see if you like it. And you can always, there's a ton of people who can give you recommendations. And just to finish it up, we've been kind of talking about this on and off throughout the program, which is Japan's influence on Western cinema and specifically American cinema. I feel like we have a very symbiotic relationship cinematically. So here I chose, this is a side by side. On the left is Perfect Blue. On the right is Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream. Darren Aronofsky was such a huge fan of Perfect Blue, bought the rights for it because he wanted to recreate this scene specifically. And he actually, I don't know if it would be a friendship, but he had at least a professional acquaintance with Khan for a while. And when Khan passed away, wrote a tribute to him. So I just get tired of people saying Aronofsky ripped off Perfect Blue, and I'm like, you guys, if you buy the rights and you name your source, it's not a ripoff. It's called paying homage, and cinema is all about being inspired by other people's work. It's not, if you name your sources, it's okay, essentially. But again, couple of things here. Seven Samurai gives us the Magnificent Seven. Hidden Fortress, one of the inspirations for Star Wars. Yojimbo gives us Fistful of Dollars. We have the J-horror remake trend. There's live action anime. That's a real mixed bag, be it in the United States or in Japan. But I gotta tell you, the Wachowski sisters live action Speed Racer is a lot of fun. I'd actually say at least in the American realm, the best live action anime we have. Granted, that bar is low, but Speed Racer is great. I showed you the Perfect Blue thing right here, and I've mentioned him a couple of times. Are you a fan of Quentin Tarantino? You need to watch Japanese cinema, specifically the crime stuff, because that is stuff he is inspired heavily by. But again, I know this is a lot, even for a 101 course, but if you're interested, I hope I've given you some recommendations and some new paths to kind of travel on. And with that, I have time for a few questions. We are getting close to closing time. I don't know why it says had
While you're checking,
but
I did have one other quick note as far as that
oh
last
sure.
slide. Going off of the symbiotic relationship between Japan and Westerns, one weird one I've found over the years from films, and one I had a film professor point out, Japan loves the movie Shane. To the point where that ending has been oft imitated over there in numerous things. Like if you see Tampopo, it is they spoof
Yes.
the ending of that movie to perfect effects.
Yeah, the Western verse the Western and the samurai are, obviously people think of that, but oh, I didn't even that good catch on that. Thank you. But yeah, does anyone have any questions? I know that this is a lot. 101s are always really hard because I'm like, I need to really whittle this down, and I don't know if I'm doing it entirely correct. I mean, we could always do a 102, but once we go into 102, stuff gets even weirder. But I do think, Todd, we should finally do J horror next year for October. I think that's
I like
a
this
fun
plan.
little road to go down. So with that, I do just want to give a quick rundown of some of our other the rest of the year's film talks. So next month in September, I'm going to be talking about labor on film. So look at how certain jobs are portrayed on screen. Look at a couple of cinematic examples. We're even going to cover the world's oldest profession on screen. In a way that's appropriate. In October, Todd is doing folk horror, so stuff like The Wicker Man, Midsommar. We are going to get into stuff like Kuroneko and Onibaba. In November, we're going to be talking about Shakespeare on screen, one of the big inspirations for a lot of movies. So, and then we're going to finish it up in December with a retrospect of the year of 1999 in cinema, which one of a really watershed year for movies. We didn't know it at the time, but the amount of influential films that came out that year is really amazing. So I will see you all next month with Labor on Film, and have a great night.